Humility is a luxury you can't afford yet, son. And honestly, looking at your GPA compared to your brother's social standing, I think it is time you learned the value of a long walk. My father, Richard Sterling, did not look up from his medium-rare Wagyu steak as he spoke, his voice as cold and clinical as the stainless steel appliances in our Greenwich, Connecticut kitchen. With a flick of his wrist that felt more like a dismissal than a gesture of parenting, he tossed a plastic-coated card onto the mahogany dinner table. It landed with a hollow click next to my water glass. It was a monthly Metropolitan Transportation Authority transit pass, the $110 price tag a drop in the ocean of his net worth. Yet to him, it was a weapon of character building. It was our 19th birthday, a day that was supposed to mark a milestone, but instead, it became the day the chasm between my twin brother and me became an unbridgeable canyon. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the evening air was shattered by the aggressive, throaty growl of a high-performance engine. I didn't have to look to know what it was. My twin brother, Jaxson, was currently sitting in the driver's seat of his birthday present, a 2024 matte black Ford Raptor with the Raptor R802A equipment group, a machine that cost my father exactly $62,450 before taxes and dealer markups. The vibration of the 5.2-liter supercharged V8 engine rattled the expensive crystal glassware on our table, a constant humming reminder of the hierarchy in the Sterling household. My name is Wyatt Sterling. I am 19 years old, and while my brother spent his days perfecting his golf swing and his nights burning through a $3,200 a month allowance at VIP club tables in Manhattan using my father's Platinum American Express, I was a junior software developer at a mid-sized firm in Stamford, grinding away at code until my eyes bled. For the last 450 days, my life has been dictated by the unrelenting schedule of the 5:45 a.m. Metro North train. While the rest of the house was silent, draped in the expensive shadows of our 6-bedroom colonial, I would be shivering on a concrete platform, the wind off the Long Island Sound cutting through my $80 North Face jacket. I watched the seasons change through the scratched, grime-streaked windows of the commuter rail, moving from the frozen darkness of January to the humid, suffocating heat of August, all while Jaxson slept until noon in high thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets. The contrast was a deliberate choice made by my father, a man who believed that because I showed an early aptitude for logic and technology, I should be forged in the fires of manual struggle, while Jaxson, the charismatic athlete, deserved to be polished like a trophy. The injustice of it wasn't just in the money or the vehicles, it was in the way my father looked through me as if I were a ghost in my own home, a software glitch in his perfectly curated family narrative. I remember the smell of the train car, a mix of damp wool, spilled coffee, and the metallic tang of the electric rails, and I compare it to the scent of the interior of that Ford Raptor, which smelled of premium Recaro leather and the arrogance of a boy who had never been told no. My father's philosophy was simple. Jaxson was the face of the family legacy, the one who would take clients to dinner and close deals with a handshake and a smile, while I was the engine room, meant to work in the dark without recognition. That birthday dinner was the final confirmation of my status. As I stared at the $110 transit pass, I could feel the heat rising in my chest, a mixture of shame and a burgeoning, quiet rage that I had suppressed for nearly 2 decades. I thought about the 3,000 lines of Python code I had written the night before for a client's logistics platform, work that had earned my firm $20,000, of which I saw a mere pittance of a junior salary. I thought about how I had carefully saved every cent, skipping lunches at the expensive bistros near the office to eat lukewarm Tupperware meals, all in the hopes that today would be the day my father finally saw me as an equal. But as the Raptor's engine roared again outside, a violent, mechanical boast, I realized that to Richard Sterling, I wasn't a son to be celebrated. I was a social experiment in austerity. Jaxson finally killed the engine and burst into the dining room, his face flushed with the kind of pure, unearned adrenaline that only comes from being given the world on a silver platter. He was wearing a $450 Stone Island hoodie and smelling of expensive cologne, his hair perfectly coiffed despite the humidity. He didn't even acknowledge the transit pass sitting in front of me. He just slapped my father on the back, a gesture of familiarity I wouldn't dare dream of, and started talking about the modifications he wanted to make to the truck. A new light bar, perhaps a performance exhaust system that would cost more than my entire year's commuting budget. My mother, seated at the other end of the table, offered a thin, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was a woman who had long ago traded her voice for the security of a Greenwich zip code, and she wouldn't break the peace now, even as her second-born son sat there being humiliated on his 19th birthday. I picked up the transit pass. The plastic felt cheap and flimsy against my calloused fingertips. My father finally looked at me, his eyes scanning my face for any sign of rebellion, but I gave him nothing. I just slipped the card into the pocket of my Levi's and nodded. I thought about the 5:45 a.m. train I would have to catch tomorrow. I thought about the damp seats and the flickering lights of the Stamford station. But more than that, I thought about the secret server I had been building in the basement of our home, a project my father knew nothing about because he never bothered to ask what I was doing with my time. While Jaxson was out spending $3,000 on bottle service at Marquee, I was building an algorithmic trading bot that was already starting to show a 3% daily return on the small capital I had managed to scrape together. The humility my father forced upon me was becoming the very weapon I would eventually use to dismantle his expectations. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of Jackson's bragging and my father's approving nods. They discussed the upcoming summer in the Hamptons, a trip I knew I wouldn't be invited to because I had a job to keep and a train to catch. I sat there in silence, a junior software developer in a room full of titans and golden boys, feeling the weight of the injustice like a physical burden on my shoulders. Every time the conversation turned to the power of the Raptor or the prestige of the country club, I retreated further into the architecture of my own mind, refining the code that would one day ensure I never had to step foot on a Metro North train again. I looked at my brother, my identical twin, and saw a version of myself that had been spared every hardship, and I wondered if he even realized that his luxury was built on the foundation of my exclusion. The night ended not with a celebration, but with a quiet retreat. I cleared my own plate, the sound of the ceramic hitting the granite countertop the only noise I was allowed to make. As I walked up the stairs to my room, I could hear them laughing in the living room, the clinking of Scotch glasses signaling the start of their real celebration. I sat at my desk, the glow of my dual monitors providing the only light in the room, and I opened my development environment. The transit pass sat on my desk, a $110 insult that I refused to look at. I focused instead on the lines of code, the logic, the variables, and the structures that didn't care about my father's approval or my brother's truck. I realized then that family isn't about who shares your DNA or who sits at your dinner table on your birthday. Family is about who sees your worth when you are standing in the shadows. For 19 years, I had been looking for a father in a man who only saw a subordinate and a brother in a boy who only saw a shadow. As I started to type, the rhythmic clicking of my mechanical keyboard replaced the fading roar of the Raptor in my mind. I wasn't just writing code anymore. I was writing my way out of a life that was never meant for me. The road ahead was long, and it started at 5:45 a.m. on a cold train platform, but for the first time, I didn't mind the walk. I knew exactly where I was going, and I knew that when I finally arrived, I wouldn't be arriving in a truck bought with someone else's money. I would be arriving on my own terms, with a legacy that was built in the silence they forced upon me. Humility may be a luxury, but independence is a necessity, and I was about to become the wealthiest man in the room, one line of code at a time. The inequality within the walls of our $1.5 million home in Scottsdale, Arizona, was not an accident or a byproduct of space constraints, but rather a meticulously calculated demonstration of our family's internal caste system. While the exterior of the house boasted pristine white stucco and a professionally landscaped xeriscape featuring $20,000 worth of imported saguaro cacti, The interior was divided into territories of luxury and zones of neglect. My twin brother Jaxson lived like a crown prince in a 500-square-foot sanctuary on the upper floor, a room that featured its own private balcony overlooking the saltwater infinity pool and a walk-in closet larger than most studio apartments. The centerpiece of his existence was a $4,000 custom-built gaming rig, liquid-cooled with glowing neon internal piping and triple 32-inch curved monitors that hummed with the electricity of a life without consequences. In stark contrast, I was relegated to a 120-square-foot converted pantry located on the ground floor, tucked into a cramped hallway directly adjacent to the utility room and the garage entrance. My bedroom had no windows and no ventilation beyond a small floor vent that carried the scent of laundry detergent and gasoline, but its most defining feature was its proximity to the appliances. Every evening, the $2,800 LG front-load dryer would begin its cycle, and for hours, the rhythmic, metallic thumping of the drum would vibrate through my thin drywall, shaking my desk and my bed until well past midnight as it processed the mountain of designer gym clothes Jaxson discarded daily. My parents, Dr. Richard and Dr. Elena Sterling, were the successful owners of a boutique dental chain with 4 locations across Maricopa County, specializing in cosmetic veneers and high-end orthodontics that catered to the wealthiest residents of the valley. Their success was measured in the precision of their schedules and the brand names they displayed. Yet their generosity was strictly reserved for the son they viewed as their greatest marketing asset. They saw Jaxson's athletic build and effortless charisma as an extension of their own brand, which is why they didn't hesitate to pay $2,400 every single month for a private social media coach. This consultant was hired to curate Jaxson's digital persona, teaching him how to pose with the Ford Raptor and which lighting would best accentuate his jawline to ensure he maintained the image of a Scottsdale elite. While they invested thousands into his perceived influence, my own appearance was treated as a budget line item to be slashed at every opportunity. I navigated my life in $12 Hanes multi-pack t-shirts and a single pair of worn-out denim jeans, dressing for utility rather than status because my reality was defined by labor. While Jaxson spent his afternoons at the country club or filming content at the gym, I was clocking 35 hours a week at a sprawling tech warehouse on the outskirts of Tempe, earning a modest $18.50 an hour. The warehouse was a massive, windowless cavern filled with the smell of industrial adhesive and the constant, high-pitched whine of forklifts. My job was to inventory and pack server components, a grueling task that required me to be on my feet for 8 hours at a time, but it was the only way I could fund my own existence. I was saving every dollar for the day I could finally leave the vibrating walls of the pantry behind. Every paycheck was a small brick in the wall of my future independence, a wall I was building in secret while my family ignored my presence. At dinner, my parents would discuss the latest marketing analytics for their dental practices or the engagement rates on Jaxson's Instagram posts, rarely bothering to ask how my shift went or why I was coming home with grease under my fingernails and a dull ache in my lower back. To them, my job was a hobby, a way for me to stay out of the way while the real business of the Sterling family moved forward. They treated my technical skills as a minor convenience, occasionally asking me to fix the Wi-Fi or troubleshoot their office iPads, but they never acknowledged that the software architecture I was studying was far more complex than anything Jaxson would ever achieve with his staged photos and borrowed prestige. Living in that pantry meant living in a state of constant, low-level sensory assault. When the dryer wasn't shaking my bed, the sound of the garage door opening and closing signaled the arrival of my parents' luxury SUVs, the heavy vibration of the motor rattling the shelves I used for my textbooks. I kept my room meticulously organized, a defense mechanism against the chaos of my environment. My dual-monitor setup, which I had bought used from a liquidating startup, was the only thing in that room that gave me a sense of purpose. On those screens, I wasn't the son who slept next to the laundry room. I was a developer, a creator, and a strategist. I spent my nights writing scripts that scraped market data, refining the trading bot that I hoped would be my ticket out of Scottsdale. I would sit there in my cheap cotton shirt, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off my glasses, while the heavy thud of Jaxson's footsteps echoed on the ceiling above me. He would often have friends over, the sounds of their laughter and the bass from his expensive sound system filtering down through the vents, a constant reminder that my exclusion was a choice they made every single day. The financial disparity was the most biting part of the injustice. I watched my father sign checks for Jaxson's private coaching, for his $500 sneakers, and for the premium fuel that went into his Raptor, all while questioning me about the cost of a new pair of work boots I needed for the warehouse. My mother would spend $600 on a single dinner for her bridge club, but would tell me that I needed to be more mindful of my electricity usage because my server was allegedly driving up the utility bill. They were obsessed with the optics of wealth, yet they practiced a strange, targeted austerity when it came to me. I was the living embodiment of their hard work narrative, the child they could point to and say they weren't spoiling, even as they poured an absolute fortune into the other twin. It was a psychological game designed to keep me humble and Jaxson entitled, a balance they felt was necessary to maintain their perfect family dynamic. They didn't realize that by depriving me of the luxury they gave Jaxson, they were giving me something far more dangerous, a relentless, cold-blooded drive to succeed without them. Every morning at 5 o'clock, I would wake up before the sun hit the desert floor, slipping out of the house quietly so as not to wake the people who barely knew I lived there. I would drive my beat-up sedan to the warehouse, the engine stuttering in the cool morning air, and I would think about the contrast between the life I was living and the life I was building. At the warehouse, I was just another badge number, another set of hands moving boxes. But in my mind, I was already gone. I would calculate my earnings for the day, subtracting the cost of my commute and my modest groceries, and I would see the number in my savings account grow. It was a slow process, a grueling climb toward a goal that felt miles away, but it was mine. Jaxson's life was a fragile construction of my parents' money and social media likes, a house of cards that could be blown over by a single bad season or a loss of interest from his followers. My life, however, was being forged in the heat of that warehouse and the silence of that pantry. I was learning the value of $1 not because my father lectured me about it, but because I saw exactly how many hours of physical labor it took to earn one. By the time I would return home in the evening, the house would be filled with the artificial warmth of a Scottsdale social life. There would be catering trays on the marble kitchen island and the smell of expensive wine in the air. I would navigate the periphery of the house like a ghost, grabbing a quick meal before retreating to my room before the laundry started. The physical space I occupied was small, but the world I was creating inside my computer was vast and full of potential. I realized that the pantry wasn't just a bedroom, it was an incubation chamber. The shaking walls and the lack of windows forced me to look inward, to focus on the code and the logic that would eventually set me free. My parents thought they were teaching me a lesson in humility, but they were actually teaching me how to survive in the dark. They were giving me the tools to build an empire that wouldn't require their approval or their name. As the dryer began its final spin cycle for the night, the high-speed whine echoing through my head, I closed my eyes and imagined a different kind of life. I imagined a place where the air didn't smell like detergent and where the people at the table actually knew my name. I knew that day was coming, and every hour I spent in that warehouse, every dollar I saved, and every line of code I wrote brought me one step closer to the exit. The inequality in that $1-million home was a heavy weight, but I was becoming strong enough to carry it until the moment I could finally drop it and walk away forever, leaving them with their coached smiles and their empty luxury. The betrayal peaked on July 11th at precisely 8:22 p.m., a moment etched into my memory with the searing clarity of a brand on skin. We were in the midst of our family's annual summer barbecue, an ostentatious display of Scottsdale wealth hosted in our backyard, where the air was a thick, sweltering soup of desert heat and the heavy, smoky aroma of premium brisket. There were 45 guests present, a collection of my parents' most influential colleagues, local socialites, and extended family members who were all draped in designer linen and sipping on chilled beverages, while the underwater LED lights of our infinity pool cycled through a spectrum of artificial blues and purples. My father, Richard, stood at the head of the long, reclaimed wood outdoor table, clinking a silver fork against a crystal tumbler to command the attention of the crowd. He looked every bit the successful patriarch in his $200 Peter Miller polo shirt, his tan deep and expensive, and as the chatter died down, he placed a heavy, supportive hand on Jackson's shoulder. With a voice full of a paternal warmth I had never once felt directed toward me, he announced to the entire gathering that he was personally paying off Jackson's $85,000 gambling debt to give him the fresh start a young man of his caliber deserves. He spoke of it as if it were a noble investment in a struggling hero, rather than a bailout for a twin brother who had spent the last 6 months betting on underground high-stakes poker games and offshore sports books while failing his basic communications classes at the local community college. The silence that followed was filled with the polite, strained nodding of guests who knew exactly how much that sum could change a life. Yet they clapped anyway, conditioned to celebrate the Sterling family's generosity. I stood at the edge of the patio, my hands still smelling of the industrial degreaser from my shift at the warehouse earlier that day, feeling the world tilt on its axis. I waited for the announcement to finish, for the mentions of the strong twin or the mention of the future, but it never came. When the crowd began to disperse back toward the buffet line, I approached my father near the outdoor kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I kept my voice low, trying to maintain some shred of dignity in front of the aunts and uncles who were watching us from the periphery. I asked him, quite simply, about the $15,000 he had promised for my upcoming tuition installment at Georgia Tech, the school I had fought tooth and nail to get into and the only path I had to a life beyond this pantry and this warehouse. I told him the deadline was in 3 days and that I had been counting on that support as the final piece of the puzzle for my junior year. My mother, Elena, who was standing nearby, didn't even let my father answer. She laughed, a sharp, melodic sound that cut through the evening air, and took a long, leisurely sip of her $14 glass of Prosecco. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if I were a child asking for an extra scoop of ice cream rather than a son asking for his promised future. She told me, without a hint of hesitation or remorse, that I was the strong one of the two and that I didn't need the hand-holding that Jaxson required to stay on the right path. Then, the words that finally broke the last remaining chord of my loyalty left her lips. She admitted that they had used my entire college fund, the money my grandfather had started for me the day I was born, as the down payment for Jackson's $62,000 Ford Raptor. She explained it with the cold logic of a bookkeeper, stating that Jaxson needed the image of success to build his brand, whereas I was already working and clearly capable of figuring things out on my own. As she spoke, I could smell the overpriced, salt-crusted brisket being carved just a few feet away, the scent becoming nauseating as I realized I was being cannibalized so my brother could feast. I looked around the patio and saw my aunts, women who had once held me as a baby, quickly turn their heads away in a synchronized motion of collective shame. They had heard it all, and they knew the staggering injustice of it, yet they chose the comfort of my father's hospitality over the defense of his discarded son. The realization that I was utterly alone in that sea of 45 people hit me with the force of a physical blow. My father didn't even look me in the eye. He just began discussing the performance specs of the Raptor with a business associate, essentially erasing my presence from the conversation before I had even walked away. The $15,000 that stood between me and my degree was nothing to them, a mere rounding error in the face of Jackson's $85,000 failure, yet they had reached into my future and plucked it out just to ensure my brother didn't have to face a single consequence for his actions. I stood there in my $12 Hanes shirt, surrounded by people who cost more to dress than I earned in a month, and I felt a cold, crystalline clarity settle over me. The strength my mother praised wasn't something they admired. It was an excuse they used to justify their neglect. They didn't see me as strong. They saw me as durable, like a piece of equipment that didn't need maintenance, while Jaxson was a delicate ornament that required constant polishing and protection. My mind raced through the numbers. 35 hours a week at $18.50 an hour wouldn't even cover the interest on the loans I would now have to take out, and my trading bot, while successful, wasn't yet producing the liquid capital I needed to bridge a $15,000 gap in 72 hours. The betrayal wasn't just about the money. It was the casual, effortless way they had decided that my hard work entitled me to nothing, while Jackson's recklessness entitled him to everything. The party continued around me, a blur of expensive laughter and the clinking of silverware against fine china, but I felt like I was watching it through a thick pane of glass. I watched Jaxson holding court near the fire pit, bragging about a business venture he was planning with the money he no longer owed, his face glowing with the unearned confidence of a man who knows he can never truly fall. I thought about the hundreds of hours I had spent in that windowless pantry, the thousands of lines of code I had written while the dryer shook my walls, and the 5:45 a.m. trains I had caught in the freezing Connecticut winters before we moved. All of it had been for nothing in their eyes. I was the servant son, the one who provided the contrast that made Jaxson look like a star. My father's words about humility being a luxury I couldn't afford echoed in my head, but I finally understood what he really meant. He wanted me to stay humble so I would never realize that I was the only one in the family actually creating value. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't scream or throw my mother's Prosecco into the pool, though the urge was a vibrating frequency in my veins. Instead, I turned and walked back into the house, through the designer kitchen that felt like a showroom for a life I was no longer a part of, and down the hall to my 120-square-foot pantry. I shut the door, and for the first time I didn't mind the sound of the LG dryer starting its nightly cycle. The vibration felt like a countdown. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, the screen illuminating the small, dark space with a cold blue light that felt more like home than the party outside ever could. I looked at my bank account, at my lines of code, and at the Georgia Tech student portal. The betrayal of July 11th had stripped me of my safety net, but it had also stripped me of my last shred of hesitation. If I was the strong one, then I would use that strength to burn the bridges they had already set on fire. I realized in that moment that family isn't the people who take from your future to pay for someone else's past. Family is a commitment to growth, and my parents had committed only to my stagnation. They had used my college fund as a down payment on a truck that Jaxson would likely wreck or grow bored of within a year, sacrificing my career for a matte black ego stroke. As I sat there, the muffled sounds of the 45 guests laughing in the backyard drifted through the vents, a distant soundtrack to the end of my childhood. I began to type, not with the desperation of a victim, but with the precision of a surgeon. I began to look for ways to liquidate every minor asset I had, to find every scholarship, every loan, and every backdoor I could find to stay in school. I wasn't just looking for tuition money anymore. I was looking for an exit strategy that would ensure I would never have to breathe the air of a Sterling family barbecue again. The overpriced brisket was ash in my mouth, but the fire in my gut was finally, for the first time in 19 years, purely my own. I was Wyatt Sterling, and if I had to build my own empire from the shaking walls of a pantry using nothing but $18 an hour wages and raw logic, then that is exactly what I would do. The fresh start wasn't for Jaxson, it was for me, and it started the moment I stopped waiting for a seat at their table. At 2:14 a.m., the silence of the Scottsdale house was absolute, broken only by the low-frequency hum of the pool pump outside and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the house's structural cooling. But inside my 120-square-foot pantry, the air felt charged with a cold, kinetic energy. I sat hunched over my scarred wooden desk, illuminated only by the sterile blue light of my dual monitors and the flickering flame of a single candle I had lit to keep my eyes from straining. But I wasn't coding tonight. Instead, I held a $2.50 spiral-bound notebook I had purchased from a generic pharmacy, its cardboard cover frayed at the edges, and I began to do what I do best. I analyzed the wreckage of my life with the clinical detachment of a forensic accountant. I didn't cry because tears were a physiological luxury that required a sense of hope I no longer possessed, and instead, I let the betrayal of the evening settle into my marrow like a permanent frost. I navigated my browser to the secure estate portal for my late grandfather's trust, a digital vault that my parents assumed I had forgotten or was too intimidated to access, and I entered the complex 16-character alphanumeric password I had memorized years ago. As the loading bar progressed, I felt a strange sense of predatory patience, realizing that for 19 years, my parents had mistaken my silence for compliance and my introversion for a lack of observation. When the ledger finally populated the screen, the truth didn't arrive as a shock, but as a mathematical confirmation of a long-suspected crime. I began to cross-reference the withdrawal history with the timeline of Jaxson's escalating lifestyle, my cheap pen scratching aggressively against the paper of my notebook as I reconciled the numbers. The total amount of misappropriated funds was staggering. $142,350 had been siphoned out of the account meant for my education and future security over the course of 36 months. I saw the $24,000 miscellaneous distribution that occurred exactly 3 days before Jackson's matte black Ford Raptor was delivered to our driveway, and I tracked the series of $5,000 transfers that perfectly aligned with his frequent weekend trips to Las Vegas and Los Angeles. My parents, the esteemed Dr. Richard and Dr. Elena Sterling, had treated my grandfather's legacy like a private line of credit to subsidize the failures of their favorite son, all while looking me in the eye and telling me that I was the strong one who needed to work 35 hours a week at a warehouse to prove my character. They truly believed that, because I was the quiet one who slept next to the laundry room and wore $12 Hanes t-shirts, I would never have the audacity to check the ledger or question the hands that fed me, however meager the portions. I realized that night, as the digital clock on my taskbar clicked over to 3 a.m., that the concept of being the bigger person was nothing more than a psychological trap they had set to ensure my silence. To them, my maturity was just a convenient way for them to rob me without facing a confrontation, a shield they held up to protect themselves from the reality of their own greed and partiality. They had gambled on my loyalty and my sense of family, betting that I would value the blood connection more than the cold, hard currency of my own stolen future. But as I stared at the final tally of $142,000, I felt that connection snap with the finality of a guillotine. The transition inside me was instantaneous and total. The son who had spent years trying to earn a nod of approval from a father who didn't see him died in that pantry, and in his place emerged a plaintiff with a clear objective and a complete lack of sentimentality. I spent the next 4 hours meticulously downloading every transaction receipt, every unauthorized transfer authorization, and every monthly statement that showed the systematic bleeding of my trust fund. I saved the files into a triple encrypted cloud drive and backed them up onto 2 separate physical flash drives, hidden inside the lining of my old laptop bag, ensuring that the evidence of their financial infidelity was beyond their reach. Every time I clicked save, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders, replaced by the heavy, solid armor of a person who no longer has anything to lose. I thought about the $15,000 for my Georgia Tech tuition that they had laughed off just hours earlier while sipping $14 Prosecco, and I realized that I wasn't just going to get that tuition money back. I was going to reclaim every cent that had been stolen to fund Jackson's vanity and my parents' delusional favoritism. My warehouse job at $18.50 an hour had taught me the value of labor, but this ledger was teaching me the power of leverage, and I intended to use every bit of it to dismantle the comfortable lie they called a family. The irony of the situation was that they had provided me with the very tools I was now using against them by forcing me into a life of self-reliance and technical obsession. If they had treated me with even a modicum of the fairness they showed Jaxson, I might have stayed in my lane, content to be the successful software engineer who helped his family from the sidelines. But their cruelty had turned my intellect into a weapon aimed directly at their reputation. I sat there in the dark, the LG dryer finally silent for the night, and I drafted a formal demand letter in my head, using the precise, unemotional language of the legal system they so greatly feared. I wasn't Wyatt the son anymore. I was Wyatt the creditor, and the Sterling family was currently in a massive deficit. I looked at the $2.50 notebook, now filled with columns of figures and dates that documented a 3-year heist, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known since we moved to Scottsdale. The injustice of the pantry, the warehouse, and the 5:45 a.m. train had all been leading to this moment of clarity where the fog of filial duty finally cleared. By 6 a.m., the first hints of a desert sunrise began to bleed into the hallway under my door, a pale orange light that signaled the start of a new day. But for my parents, it was the beginning of the end of their era of unchallenged authority. I knew that when they woke up and went about their routine of boutique dental appointments and social media curation, they would have no idea that the quiet boy in the pantry had already built a digital gallows for their lifestyle. I thought about Jaxson upstairs, sleeping off his latest binge in his 500-square-foot sanctuary, and I realized that his Raptor was essentially bought with the sweat of my brow and the theft of my grandfather's wishes. The sense of unfairness that had burned in my chest at the barbecue had cooled into a hard, sharp diamond of intent. I would not be the bigger person because the bigger person gets stepped on, and I was finished being the floor for my family's ascent. It was time to switch the narrative from a story of a neglected son to a case study in corporate and estate fraud, and I had all the evidence I needed to win. I closed my laptop with a soft click and leaned back in my chair, listening to the house begin to wake up, the sounds of my mother's expensive espresso machine hissing in the kitchen and the heavy thud of my father's footsteps on the stairs. They were moving through a world they thought they controlled, unaware that the foundation was already rotting beneath them because they had forgotten that the most dangerous person in any room is the one who has been forced to watch from the corners. I tucked the $2.50 notebook into the back of my desk drawer, a humble item that now held the power to collapse a $1.5 million house of cards. My heart rate was steady, my mind was clear, and my resolve was absolute. I would attend Georgia Tech, and I would do it with the money that was rightfully mine, even if I had to tear the Sterling name apart to get it. The lesson of the night was simple. When family treats you like a line item, you treat them like a lawsuit. As I walked toward the bathroom to splash cold water on my face before my shift at the warehouse, I caught my reflection in the mirror and didn't see the strong one my mother mocked. I saw a man who was about to collect a very old, very large debt, and I knew that by the time I was finished, humility would be a luxury my parents truly couldn't afford. I realized that the psychological cage they had kept me in was only as strong as my desire for their love, and since that desire had been incinerated at the BBQ, I was effectively free. The $142,350 was not just a number on a screen. It was the price of my silence, my comfort, and my future, and they had spent it on a truck and gambling debts without a second thought. Every hour I spent moving boxes in that Tempe warehouse from now on would be fueled by the knowledge that I was the one holding the cards, waiting for the perfect moment to lay them on the table in front of their 45 guests, or perhaps in front of a judge who cared more about ledgers than about social media coaches. The disparity in our Scottsdale home was no longer a source of pain, but a roadmap for my retaliation, a clear indication of exactly where they had overextended themselves and where they were most vulnerable. I was Wyatt Sterling, 19 years old, and while my brother was revving his engine for the world to see, I was quietly shifting the entire landscape beneath his tires, preparing for the moment when the Raptor's matte black paint wouldn't be enough to save him from the reality of what our parents had done. Family isn't a license to steal, and I was about to revoke their membership in mine with the surgical precision they used on their patients, leaving nothing behind but the cold, hard truth of the ledger. To move from being a victim to being a victor, I knew I needed more than just anger. I needed the kind of cold, undeniable evidence that functions like a scalpel in a courtroom, which is why I sought out Elias Thorne. His office was located on the top floor of a glass and steel monolith in downtown Phoenix, a space that breathed an atmosphere of quiet, lethal competence and smelled perpetually of expensive pipe tobacco and $5,000 hand-stitched leather chairs. Elias was a forensic accountant who carried a reputation for being the man you call when you want to bury an empire, and his fee reflected that at a staggering $350 an hour, a price I paid using the very last of my secret trading bot profits and the overtime pay I had scavenged from 35-hour weeks at the warehouse. As I sat across from him, in the dim, amber light of his office, watching him leaf through the initial documents I had printed in the middle of the night, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction, knowing that my parents' obsession with status had finally met its match in a man who specialized in dismantling it. We spent hours under the soft glow of his desk lamp, a green-shaded banker's light that cast long shadows across the mahogany, pulling what Elias called the smoking gun from the digital wreckage of my grandfather's estate. It wasn't just a single error or a misunderstanding, but rather a systematic plunder highlighted by 3 specific, unauthorized wire transfers sent directly from my trust account to a high-end vehicle dealership in Mesa, Arizona, totaling the exact amount needed to secure Jaxson's matte black Ford Raptor. The evidence we compiled was not merely substantial, it was an airtight tomb for my parents' reputation, consisting of 65 pages of meticulously annotated bank statements that tracked every penny siphoned from my future to fund my brother's present. Elias helped me isolate 12 distinct forged signature samples, where my father had attempted to mimic my grandfather's shaky, late-life handwriting and my own underdeveloped signature, his arrogance leading him to believe that no one would ever bother to place them under the scrutiny of a high-resolution scanner. Perhaps the most damning pieces of the puzzle were the 4 high-definition screenshots we obtained through a legal discovery request that showed my mother standing in the bank's lobby at precisely 11:05 a.m. on a Tuesday, looking chic in her designer sunglasses while she moved the funds that were supposed to pay for my Georgia Tech tuition into an account for Jaxson's gambling debts. Seeing her face on that grainy security footage, captured in the act of erasing my life's work to save her favorite son from the consequences of his own stupidity, burned away the very last shred of hesitation I had about destroying the family name. I took the entire collection of evidence, now housed in a thick, heavy manila folder that felt like it weighed 50 pounds, and I brought it back to my 120-square-foot pantry, the room that had become my war room. For 14 days, that folder lived under the loose floorboard beneath my bed, right next to the wall where the $2,800 LG dryer continued to rumble and shake, its vibrations a constant reminder of why I was doing this. Those 14 days were the hardest of my life, as I had to sit at the dinner table in my $12 Hanes t-shirt and listen to my father brag about Jaxson's growing social media influence and my mother complain about the rising cost of our country club membership. I watched Jaxson toss the keys to his $62,000 truck onto the counter, the matte black finish gleaming in the kitchen lights, and I felt a cold, predatory peace knowing that every mile he drove was a mile closer to the day I would repossess his reality. I didn't break character once, continuing to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to drive to my warehouse job, letting the sweat and the dust of the Tempe heat mask the intensity of the plan I was refining every night in the dark. Every time my mother laughed or my father dismissed me with a grunt, I would go back to my room and touch the edge of that floorboard, feeling the physical presence of the 65 pages of bank statements and the 12 forged signatures that were about to end their charade forever. The psychological toll of living as a double agent in my own home was immense, as I had to navigate the daily injustices of the Scottsdale household with a mask of quiet compliance, but the manila folder was my anchor, a physical manifestation of the truth that my parents had tried so hard to bury. I would lay in bed at night, feeling the floorboards vibrate from the dryer's final spin cycle, and I would visualize the moment I would lay those 4 high-definition screenshots on the table, watching the color drain from my mother's face as she realized her chic afternoon at the bank had been recorded for posterity. I thought about the $350 an hour I was paying Elias Thorne and how it was the best investment I had ever made, far more valuable than the $65,000 truck or the $85,000 gambling bailout, because it was buying me my dignity and my freedom. Those 14 days allowed me to move from a place of emotional reaction to a place of strategic execution, ensuring that when I finally struck, there would be no room for excuses, no possibility of a fresh start for anyone involved. I was no longer the strong one who would just figure it out. I was the plaintiff who had done the math, and the math was undeniable. My brother Jaxson remained completely oblivious, his life a shallow loop of gym sessions and curated photo shoots, never suspecting that the brother he treated as a background character was currently holding the deed to his lifestyle in a folder under the floor. He would come into the kitchen, smelling of expensive cologne and sweat, and ask me to help him with some tech issue on his phone, and I would do it with a steady hand, my mind already calculating the legal interest I would charge on every dollar they had stolen from me. The disparity in our Scottsdale home had reached its peak, with the Crown Prince living in a 500-square-foot sanctuary while the person he was robbing slept in a pantry, but the power dynamic had already shifted in the shadows. The $50,000 leather chairs in Elias Thorne's office and the smell of expensive tobacco became my new standard for what success looked like, a stark contrast to the scent of laundry detergent and gasoline that defined my current existence. I was building a case that was as solid as the steel beams of the warehouse I worked in, a structure of facts and figures that would withstand any emotional manipulation my mother could throw at me. As the 14th day approached, I felt a sense of calm that can only come from total preparation, a feeling that the 14 days of silence had been the most productive period of my life. I had learned how to observe without reacting, how to document without judging, and how to wait for the exact moment when the target is most exposed. My father's arrogance was his greatest weakness, a flaw that allowed him to believe his quietest son was also his dimmest, and I intended to use that oversight to its fullest potential. I looked at the 2:14 a.m. timestamp on my digital clock and remembered the night I first opened the ledger, a moment that felt like a lifetime ago, but was only the beginning of this transformation. I was Wyatt Sterling, and I was no longer a junior developer waiting for a promotion. I was a man who had hired a professional to help him reclaim his birthright from the people who had tried to sell it for a matte black paint job. The folder under the floorboard was more than just paper and ink. It was the physical proof that family is a bond that can be broken by greed, and that sometimes the only way to save your future is to litigate your past. I spent the final night of those 2 weeks double-checking every detail, making sure the 65 pages were in chronological order and that the forged signatures were clearly highlighted to show the discrepancies in the loops of the letters. I thought about the 45 guests at the BBQ and how they had turned their heads away in shame, and I realized that soon they wouldn't be able to look away because the truth would be screaming at them from a legal filing. The $142,350 was just the beginning of what my parents owed me, for the years of sleeping in a pantry and the thousands of hours spent on a train while they built a monument to my brother's mediocrity. I was ready to step out of the shadows and into the light of a courtroom or a boardroom or wherever it took to make them understand that being the bigger person is a choice, and I had chosen to be the person who wins. The rumble of the LG dryer finally cut out, leaving the house in a heavy, expectant silence, and I closed my eyes, ready for the 14th day to end and for the real work to begin. I was no longer a shadow in a $1 million house. I was the architect of its downfall, and the manila folder was my blueprint. The trap was set for August 1st, a date that my parents had circled in their gold leaf planners for months as the night of Jaxson's pre-college blowout party, an event designed to celebrate his supposedly bright future before he headed off to a local college that had only accepted him because of my father's significant donation to their athletic fund. The Scottsdale heat had finally broken into a dry, whispering evening breeze, but the atmosphere inside our $1.5 million home was stifling with the scent of unearned success and the noise of 60 people who valued status over substance. My parents had spared no expense to ensure this was the social event of the season, commissioning a $5,500 custom sushi bar where chefs in pristine whites sliced bluefin tuna and wagyu beef on marble slabs for guests who barely knew the difference between sashimi and rolls. Jaxson was the centerpiece of the spectacle, leaning against the kitchen island and bragging to a circle of fawning friends about the torque and horsepower of his matte black Ford Raptor, looking every bit the part of the pampered heir in a $450 off-white hoodie that still had the faint scent of the boutique air conditioning on it. I arrived at the house at precisely 9:30 p.m., but I didn't enter through the garage or slip into my pantry room like a ghost as I usually did. Instead, I walked through the massive iron and glass front doors and moved through the crowd with a deliberate, predatory grace that stopped conversations in their tracks. I was not wearing the $12 Hanes t-shirts or the grease-stained work boots from the warehouse tonight. I was wearing a $1,200 charcoal gray tailored suit that I had purchased in cash with my secret savings, the fabric moving with a crisp, expensive weight that felt like a suit of armor against the family that had tried to bury me. I didn't bring a gift for my brother, nor did I bring a card or a fake smile to contribute to the charade of his transition into adulthood. In my left hand, I carried a high-lumen portable BenQ projector, and in my right pocket, I gripped a silver 64-gigabyte thumb drive that contained the 65 pages of bank statements, the 12 forged signatures, and the high-definition screenshots from the bank's lobby. As I stepped into the light of the vaulted living room, my father looked up from his glass of 20-year-old scotch, his eyes narrowing as he took in my appearance, his confusion visible as he tried to reconcile the son who worked 35 hours a week at a warehouse with the man standing before him in a perfectly fitted Italian suit. My mother paused mid-sentence while describing Jaxson's social media engagement to a neighbor, her $14 glass of Prosecco trembling slightly as she saw the cold, crystalline intent in my eyes. The contrast between Jaxson and me had never been more pronounced than it was in that moment. But for the first time in 19 years, the power dynamic had completely inverted. While Jaxson stood there in his oversized streetwear, surrounded by the expensive trappings my parents had bought to mask his lack of character, I stood as a self-made entity, a junior software developer who had used logic and patience to build a case that would dismantle everything they had worked to project. I didn't say a word as I walked over to the large, white, expansive wall near the outdoor terrace, the very place where they usually projected highlights of Jaxson's football games or family vacation montages. I set the projector down on a limestone pedestal and plugged in the drive, the mechanical clicking of the device sounding like the hammer of a gun being pulled back in the sudden, expectant silence of the room. The 60 guests began to gravitate toward the center of the house, their curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in the party's energy, and I could see the first flickers of genuine fear crossing my mother's face as she realized I wasn't there to celebrate. I thought about the 5:45 a.m. trains, the windowless pantry, the vibrating LG dryer, and the July 11th barbecue where they laughed at the idea of my future, and I felt a surge of cold, calculated adrenaline. This was the moment where the strong one stopped being their silent backbone and became their public reckoning. I looked at Jaxson, who was still holding a piece of expensive sushi, a confused and arrogant smirk playing on his lips as if he thought this was some kind of surprise tribute I had prepared for him. My father stepped forward, his voice a low, warning growl as he asked me what the hell I thought I was doing in front of their guests, but I simply ignored him and hit the power button on the remote. The wall flickered to life, the bright light of the projector cutting through the dim, ambient party lighting, and instead of a montage of childhood photos, the screen was filled with a massive, high-definition scan of the trust fund ledger showing the $142,350 deficit. The room went deathly silent, the only sound being the low hum of the projector's cooling fan as I began to scroll through the evidence with the steady hand of a man who had already won. I displayed the 3 unauthorized wire transfers to the Mesa dealership, the numbers glowing in giant, unforgiving font for every socialite and colleague in Scottsdale to see. Then, I switched the slide to the 12 forged signatures, placing them side by side with my father's actual handwriting and my grandfather's legal signature from the original trust documents, letting the discrepancies speak for themselves. The gasps from the audience were audible, a collective intake of breath as the realization of my parents' financial infidelity began to sink in. I didn't need to narrate the slides. The math was doing all the talking, revealing that the fresh start they had given Jaxson was funded by the systematic theft of my grandfather's legacy and my personal future. The climax of the presentation arrived when I pulled up the 4 high-definition screenshots of my mother in the bank lobby, her designer sunglasses pushed up onto her head as she stood at the teller window, authorized the movement of my tuition money into Jackson's debt-ridden account. In the projected image, she looked exactly like the woman standing in the room now, but the context had shifted from a suburban matriarch to a documented thief. My mother dropped her glass, the Prosecco shattering on the travertine floor with a sharp, echoing crack that punctuated the absolute silence of the 60 guests. My father was frozen, his face a mottled shade of purple as he realized that the quiet son he had underestimated had not only checked the ledger but had hired a forensic accountant to turn his private greed into a public spectacle. Jackson's smirk had vanished, replaced by a pale, hollow look of realization as he looked from the screen to his friends, seeing his curated image of the golden boy dissolve into the reality of a boy who lived off his brother's stolen blood. I stood there in my charcoal suit, the blue light of the projector reflecting off the sharp lines of my face, and I finally felt the weight of the pantry and the warehouse fall away for good. I wasn't the bigger person tonight. I was the architect of the truth, and I was watching the $1.5 million house of cards collapse in real time. The betrayal that had peaked on July 11th was now being repaid with interest, and the humility my father once said I couldn't afford was now the only thing left for them to buy. I looked at the crowd, seeing my aunts and uncles who had turned their heads away at the BBQ, and I saw that they couldn't look away now. The 65 pages of evidence were not just documents, they were a declaration of independence. I reached out and turned off the projector, the room plunging into a heavy, suffocating darkness that was only broken by the flickering outdoor pool lights. I didn't stay to hear their excuses or to watch my mother cry. I simply tucked the thumb drive back into my pocket, picked up my projector, and walked back out the front doors. As I walked toward the car I had rented for the evening, a black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe that I had parked right next to Jackson's Raptor, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any sleep I had ever had in that pantry. I had switched from son to plaintiff, and the trial was already over in the court of public opinion. My name is Wyatt Sterling, and I am 19 years old, and tonight I proved that you can take a man's tuition, you can take his bedroom, and you can take his dignity, but you can never take his ability to count. The Sterling family legacy died at 9:45 p.m. on August 1st, and as I drove away from the Scottsdale house, leaving the sounds of the frantic, whispered arguments behind me, I knew that my own legacy was just beginning. Family isn't the people who share your house while they rob your soul. Family is the integrity you keep when everyone else is selling theirs for a matte black truck. I was heading to Georgia Tech, and I was doing it on my own terms, with the $142,000 that was about to be returned to me by way of a legal settlement that would leave my parents with nothing but the truth they tried so hard to hide. The trap had sprung, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the key to the exit. The moment of execution arrived with a chilling precision that no amount of Scottsdale luxury could mask, as the atmosphere in our $1.5 million home shifted from a celebratory high to a vacuum of absolute dread. My father, Richard Sterling, stood at the center of the vaulted living room, his face flushed with the pride of a man who believed his legacy was secure, and he raised a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25-year-old sherry oak towards the ceiling. "A toast to Jackson's future," he shouted, his voice booming with a hollow authority that echoed off the Italian marble floors, and 60 guests raised their glasses in a synchronized gesture of social obligation. This was the pinnacle of their charade, the crowning achievement of a year spent grooming my twin brother into a phantom of success. But I was already standing in the shadows by the limestone pedestal, my finger hovering over the play button of the portable projector. I stepped forward into the center of the room, the sharp lines of my $1,200 charcoal suit cutting through the warm amber party lighting like a blade, and I spoke with a voice that was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of the filial warmth I had once tried so hard to manufacture. "Actually, Dad, before we toast to a future built on sand, let's take a look at the financing behind that future," I said, and the room suddenly felt smaller, the air thick with a collective, instinctive realization that the script of the evening had been permanently altered. I hit the play button, and the wall behind me, which usually displayed curated photos of Jackson's athletic achievements, was instantly consumed by a high-resolution scan of my grandfather's trust ledger. The numbers were massive, rendered in a brutal, unforgiving shade of red that documented the $142,350 theft in a way that made it impossible to ignore. I watched the eyes of my father's biggest business partners, men who managed millions and valued nothing more than fiscal integrity, as they scanned the list of unauthorized wire transfers and the 12 forged signatures that Elias Thorne had highlighted with surgical clarity. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt physical, an absolute void of sound that was only broken by the sharp, jarring crack of a $50 porcelain sushi plate shattering on the travertine floor as one of the guests let it slip from their numb fingers. "You didn't build his character, Dad, and you certainly didn't invest in a legacy. You stole my life to buy his toys," I continued. My gaze locked onto my father's eyes as the color drained from his face, leaving behind a sallow, terrified mask of the man he used to be. I scrolled to the next slide, which featured the high-definition screenshots of my mother in the Mesa Bank lobby, her designer sunglasses perched on her head as she signed away the funds meant for my Georgia Tech tuition to cover Jackson's high-stakes gambling debts. The crowd was frozen, 60 people draped in thousands of dollars of silk and linen, now forced to witness the moral bankruptcy of the family they had envied. My mother, Elena, clutched her $14 glass of Prosecco so hard I thought it would shatter in her hand, her mouth open in a silent, horrified gasp as she saw her own betrayal projected 20 feet high for all of Scottsdale society to see. Jaxson stood next to her, the $450 off-white hoodie now looking like a cheap costume on a boy who had finally realized that his entire identity was a stolen asset. I didn't wait for them to recover or for my father to find the words to lie his way out of the corner I had spent 14 days painting him into. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope, the heavy vellum paper crackling in the silence of the room like a localized thunderstorm. I walked across the marble floor, the sound of my leather soles echoing with a finality that signaled the end of my tenure as the quiet son in the pantry. I stood directly in front of my father, whose Macallan was now trembling in his hand, and I handed him the legal summons for embezzlement and fiduciary fraud in front of the very men whose respect he valued more than my life. I saw his business partners, the titans of the local dental and real estate industries, take a collective step back, physically distancing themselves from a man who had been outed as a thief in his own home. This was the execution of the life I had known, a surgical strike against the arrogance that had kept me in a 1,200-square-foot pantry while the golden boy revved a $62,000 engine. The details on the screen behind me were a forensic roadmap of their decline, showing the exact dates and timestamps of when they decided my future was less important than Jackson's image. Every guest in that room could see the 65 pages of bank statements summarized in a single devastating bar graph that showed my education fund flatlining while Jackson's discretionary spending spiked into the stratosphere. I had been the strong one, the one who took the 5:45 a.m. train and worked 35 hours a week at a tech warehouse for $18.50 an hour. But tonight, I was the one holding the ledger. My father looked down at the summons, the legal language describing his crimes in cold black and white terms, and for the first time in 19 years, he had no dismissal, no lecture on humility, and no weapon to use against me. He was a man who had been caught robbing his own son to subsidize a lie, and the weight of that truth was crushing the very foundation of the $1.5 million house we stood in. I looked at my brother, the twin who had spent $3,200 a month on VIP club tables while I saved for a suit, and I saw the absolute emptiness in his eyes as his friends began to whisper and drift away toward the exits. The party was over, not just for the night, but for the Sterling family as a social entity in Scottsdale. The betrayal that had reached its peak on July 11th had been met with a response so total and so public that there was no possibility of a fresh start for anyone but me. I felt a sense of relief that was almost intoxicating, a release of the pressure that had been building since I first realized that being the bigger person was just an invitation for them to step on me. I had switched from son to plaintiff, and in doing so, I had reclaimed the narrative of my own life from the people who had tried to write me out of it as a background character. As the first few guests began to flee the house, unable to bear the weight of the scandal unfolding in the living room, I turned back to the wall and hit the button to close the presentation, the bright light of the projector vanishing and leaving the room in a dim, uncomfortable shadow. I didn't need to say another word. The 65 pages of evidence and the 12 forged signatures would do the talking in the courtroom where my father would soon be spending his time. I walked past my mother, who was now weeping silently into a designer cocktail napkin, and past my brother, who looked like he wanted to crawl into the engine of his Raptor and disappear. I headed toward the front door, the portable projector under my arm and the silver thumb drive back in my pocket, feeling the cool desert air waiting for me outside. I had entered that house as the son who slept next to a laundry room, but I was leaving as the man who had audited his own family and found them lacking in every way that mattered. The execution was complete, a perfect alignment of logic, evidence, and timing that had dismantled 19 years of injustice in less than 15 minutes. My name is Wyatt Sterling, and while my father once told me that humility was a luxury I couldn't afford, I realized as I stepped onto the driveway that integrity was the only currency that truly held its value when the lights went down. I looked at the 2024 matte black Ford Raptor sitting in the driveway, a truck that was effectively bought with the theft of my grandfather's wishes, and I knew that by the time the legal process was finished, it wouldn't be Jackson's anymore. I got into my black Chevrolet Tahoe and started the engine, the smooth, quiet purr of the vehicle a stark contrast to the aggressive roar of the Raptor. I drove away from the Sterling home, watching it shrink in my rearview mirror, a monument to a past I was finally finished with. The $15,000 for my Georgia Tech tuition would be paid, along with every other cent they had misappropriated, plus interest and legal fees, because the law doesn't care who the golden boy is. Family isn't blood, and it certainly isn't a joint bank account managed by a thief. Family is the people who respect your boundaries and honor the legacy they are entrusted with. My parents had failed that test at every turn, choosing the optics of wealth over the reality of character. And tonight, they had lost both. As I drove toward the freeway, heading away from Scottsdale and toward a future that was finally, legally mine, I thought about the moral of the story I had just lived. You can take a man's room, you can take his time, and you can even take his name, but if he knows how to code and how to count, he will eventually find a way to take back everything you stole. The road to Atlanta was long, But for the first time, I wasn't catching a train at dawn. I was driving toward a life of my own making, and the only thing I was carrying with me was the truth. The Sterling name might be tarnished beyond repair in the eyes of their peers, but I was done polishing their trophies. I was moving on to build something that wouldn't require a projector to prove its worth. The aftermath of that night on August 1st was nothing short of a total scorched-earth bloodbath for the Sterling family reputation and their carefully constructed financial house of cards. Once the legal summons for embezzlement and fiduciary fraud was handed over in front of Scottsdale's elite, the fallout was instantaneous and irreversible, moving with the cold, mechanical inevitability of a logic gate. My father, Richard Sterling, and my mother, Elena, were suddenly faced with the terrifying reality of a 5-year prison sentence and the permanent revocation of their professional dental licenses if they didn't make immediate and total restitution for the $142,350 they had siphoned from my grandfather's trust. To avoid the cold gray walls of a federal penitentiary, they were forced into a desperate, humiliating fire sale of the very lifestyle they had used to keep me in a pantry. Within 48 hours, the $62,000 matte black Ford Raptor was hauled away by a high-end liquidator, sold at a loss to cover the initial wave of legal fees and forensic accounting costs that Elias Thorne had racked up. They were compelled to liquidate their entire $200,000 diversified investment portfolio, watching decades of wealth evaporate in a series of frantic wire transfers meant to satisfy the court-ordered settlement that required them to pay me back every stolen cent, plus an 8% compounded interest penalty for the duration of the misappropriation. I watched from a distance as their social standing in Scottsdale dissolved, the fawning friends and social media followers vanishing the moment the word embezzlement was whispered in the corridors of the country club. My name is Wyatt Sterling, and as I walked out of that Scottsdale house for the final time, I didn't look back at the luxury SUVs or the infinity pool that had been the backdrop of my exclusion. I moved across the country to Atlanta, Georgia, where I secured a $2,800 a month high-rise apartment in Midtown, a space that features floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vibrant urban sprawl, a view that is a constant, shimmering reminder that I am no longer confined to a windowless pantry. My new life is defined by a level of peace that money can't buy, but the money certainly helps maintain the boundaries I've spent 19 years building. I sat on my designer sofa on the first night in my new home, holding my $1,100 iPhone 15 Pro Max in titanium, and I felt a profound sense of closure as I scrolled through my contacts and systematically blocked the numbers of my father, my mother, and my twin brother. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final plea for forgiveness, and no emotional reconciliation. There was only the digital silence of a connection being severed for good. The technical specifications of my independence are far more satisfying than any praise they could have offered me. While my parents are currently navigating the ruins of their boutique dental chain, which has seen a 40% drop in high-end clientele due to the scandal, I am thriving in my junior software developer role at a major fintech firm in Atlanta. My bank account, now bolstered by the $176,000 settlement check, serves as a fortress against the poverty they tried to impose on me. I no longer wake up at 5:45 a.m. to catch a grime-streaked train, nor do I wear $12 Hanes t-shirts out of necessity. I wear the success that I built in the dark, line by line, while they were busy polishing the ego of a son who had no foundation. The contrast between my current reality and the life of my twin brother, Jaxson, has become a masterclass in the laws of cause and effect. Jaxson, the former golden boy who once revved a $62,000 engine while I slept next to a laundry room, is now intimately acquainted with the reality of manual labor and the weight of actual responsibility. With the Raptor gone and our parents' ability to subsidize his vanity completely evaporated, Jaxson has been forced to take a job working 50 hours a week at a high-volume gas station on the edge of the desert. He spends his days inhaling the fumes of mid-grade gasoline and dealing with the frustrations of the general public for a fraction of the hourly rate I used to earn at the warehouse. Instead of a matte black beast with a 5.2-liter supercharged V8, he now commutes in a used, faded 2009 Toyota Corolla that he bought for $4,000 with the last bit of money our parents could scrape together. The car has high mileage, a dented passenger door, and a persistent rattle that reminds him with every mile that the days of unearned luxury are over. He is living the life my father once tried to force upon me as a lesson in humility. But unlike me, Jaxson doesn't have the internal architecture or the technical skills to build a way out of the dirt. He is a boy who was given the world and lost it because he didn't realize that a gift you didn't earn is just a loan you can't repay. The psychological landscape of my family has been permanently altered by the realization that the strong one was the only one with the power to destroy the lie they were living. My mother sends letters that I never open, her expensive stationery a haunting echo of a life that was built on the theft of her son's future. My father, once a man of clinical coldness and absolute authority, is now a cautionary tale among his peers, a man who traded his integrity and his son's trust for a truck and a social media coach. They are living in a world of consequences, and for the first time in their lives, they cannot buy their way out of the narrative. I realize now that the injustice of my childhood wasn't a mistake. It was a catalyst. The shaking walls of that pantry and the metallic tang of the Stamford train station were the forge that created the man who was capable of hiring Elias Thorne and dismantling a $1 million betrayal. I don't feel anger anymore, only a clinical, detached sense of satisfaction that the ledger has finally been balanced. In my high-rise in Atlanta, the air is clean, the silence is expensive, and the only vibration I feel is the gentle hum of the city beneath me. I spend my evenings refining my trading algorithms, watching the numbers climb with a precision that my father never understood. I am no longer a line item in someone else's budget or a background character in a brother's social media feed. I am the CEO of my own existence, a man who knows the exact value of every dollar because I've seen what people are willing to sacrifice to steal them. The moral of my story isn't just about revenge, it's about the fact that family is a social contract, and when one party breaches that contract by stealing the future of another, the contract is null and void. My parents and Jaxson are now just names on a legal document, ghosts of a past that I have outgrown and outcalculated. As the sun sets over the Atlanta skyline, casting long, golden shadows across my living room, I think about that $2.50 notebook and the 2:14 a.m. realization that changed everything. I am Wyatt Sterling, 19 years old, and I have learned that the greatest luxury in life isn't a matte black truck or a boutique dental practice. It is the ability to walk away from a toxic legacy with your head held high and your bank account full of the money that was rightfully yours. My brother got the gold for 19 years while I was left in the dirt, but the problem with gold that isn't yours is that it eventually turns back into lead. I took the dirt they gave me and I turned it into a foundation, and on that foundation, I have built a life that they will never be invited to share. The bloodbath of the aftermath was necessary to clear the ground for a new beginning, and as I look out at the city lights, I know that for the first time, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who stay when the truth comes out, and in the end, the only person who stayed for me was the version of myself that refused to be erased. I am the plaintiff, the victor, and finally, the only Sterling whose name still means something of value.